When the River Stops Arguing with the River by Professor Xenial, Apricity, Psithurist. Good evening. Today we shall discuss a phenomenon I have observed repeatedly among human beings. It concerns the curious habit of becoming divided against oneself. This is not generally intentional. Very few people wake in the morning and announce, "Today I shall oppose my own flourishing." And yet the behavior remains surprisingly common. When observing your species, one notices that many individuals have inherited ideas they did not consciously choose. Instructions, expectations, conditions, rules, definitions of worth, definitions of failure, definitions of what constitutes a good person, a successful person, a spiritual person, a strong person, a man, a woman, a parent, a citizen, a productive member of society. The collection is quite extensive. Some individuals appear to be carrying entire museums. The difficulty is not that these ideas exist. The difficulty is that they are frequently accepted before examination. And what is accepted before examination often becomes mistaken for one's own voice. A person may spend years obeying instructions they never consciously agreed to, then wonder why life feels heavy. One of the more interesting observations is that the human organism possesses a remarkable guidance system. When operating harmoniously, there is a feeling of coherence, a feeling of alignment. Energy moves naturally. Action emerges with relatively little internal friction. One might describe it as a river moving downhill. The river does not strain. The river does not attend motivational seminars. The river simply flows according to its nature. Yet, many individuals have learned to distrust this process. They have been taught that strain is virtue, that exhaustion is evidence, that suffering proves sincerity, that self-neglect is noble, that constant pressure indicates importance. The organism itself rarely agrees with these conclusions. It sends notifications, fatigue, tension, restlessness, discomfort, confusion, a gradual reduction of vitality. These messages are often ignored, which only causes the volume to increase. Human biology is remarkably patient until it isn't. There eventually comes a point where the old pattern can no longer be maintained. The individual discovers they cannot continue gripping reality with the same degree of force. The strategy becomes too expensive. The system refuses further investment. At this stage, many people believe something has gone wrong. I've frequently observed the opposite. Something has finally become honest. The old structure collapses not because the person has failed. The old structure collapses because it was incompatible with reality. A branch does not break because the tree is weak. Sometimes it breaks because it was never meant to support that much weight. I've noticed that many forms of inner conflict originate from a disagreement between inherited instruction and direct experience. The instruction says one thing, life says another. The instruction demands force, life invites adjustment. The instruction insists, life observes. There is another complication worthy of mention, one that receives surprisingly little attention. It concerns proximity. Human beings possess a remarkable tendency to exchange patterns with one another, far more than they generally suspect. Opinions travel this way. Habits travel this way, fears travel this way, expectations travel this way. Entire emotional climates appear capable of migrating from one nervous system to another with minimal paperwork. Many individuals imagine themselves to be operating independently while unknowingly participating in a collective weather system. They begin speaking differently, thinking differently, responding differently, prioritizing differently. And because the transition is gradual, it is often interpreted as personal choice rather than environmental influence. This is not a criticism. It appears to be one of the mechanisms through which your species learns. Unfortunately, it is also one of the mechanisms through which your species acquires unnecessary confusion. I have observed individuals spend years attempting to understand why a particular pattern appeared in their lives, only to discover in hindsight that the pattern arrived shortly after prolonged exposure to another individual who was carrying it. The realization is frequently delayed. This is because human beings are exceptionally talented at noticing trajectories only after colliding with their conclusions. One travels a road, then reaches a wall, then turns around and says, "Ah." The "ah" is often the most educational portion of the journey. It is therefore wise to attend carefully to the company one keeps, not from judgment, not from superiority, but from simple ecological awareness. For the human psyche appears less like an isolated fortress and more like a garden, and gardens are influenced by what grows nearby. This does not mean one should fear others. That would be impractical. There are rather a lot of them. It simply means one should notice. Notice how one feels after certain conversations. Notice what thoughts become more frequent around particular individuals. Notice what tendencies become easier. Notice what tendencies become more difficult. Notice whether one's life becomes more coherent or more fragmented through repeated association. For there are people whose presence reminds one of one's highest possibilities, and there are people whose presence repeatedly invites one into familiar confusion. Neither category requires condemnation. Both categories require observation. The difficulty is that borrowed patterns rarely arrive carrying identification documents. They introduce themselves as your own thoughts, your own impulses, your own conclusions. Only later, perhaps years later, does one discover that was not entirely mine. And by then, fortunately, one has learned something. One has reached the wall. One has turned around, and one has been granted the sacred human privilege of saying, "Ah, there you are." The resulting tension can continue for years, sometimes decades. Eventually, the individual reaches a threshold. The effort required to maintain the old pattern exceeds the effort required to release it. And so release occurs. Sometimes gracefully, sometimes dramatically. Humans seem to enjoy both options. At this point, I am often asked, "Professor Psithurist, what if I have been wrong?" An excellent question, though I suspect it is frequently the wrong question. A more useful insight might be, what if I have been learning? A tree does not apologize for possessing fewer rings in the past. Many human beings treat previous versions of themselves as enemies. This has always puzzled me. Those earlier versions were doing the best they could with the information available at the time. The fact that one now sees further does not invalidate the journey. There is another misconception I should like to address. It concerns forgiveness. Many people imagine forgiveness to be a moral obligation, a duty, a burden, a task requiring effort. This appears unnecessarily complicated. From my observations, forgiveness often emerges naturally once blame has exhausted itself. Once one sees clearly that most people are operating from conditions they do not fully understand, from fears they did not consciously create, from assumptions they never examined, from wounds they inherited, from confusion they mistake for certainty. This does not remove accountability. Accountability remains useful, very useful. A stove may be forgiven. One should still refrain from sitting on it. Understanding and accountability are not opposites. They are neighbors. The difficulty arises when people attempt to use blame as a tool of correction. This rarely functions as intended. Blame tends to reproduce the very conditions it seeks to eliminate. A person who understands this begins to conserve energy, not through indifference, through clarity. One no longer feels compelled to carry every offense into the future. One no longer mistakes resentment for protection. One no longer imagines that suffering improves accuracy. Instead, one becomes available. Available to learn. Available to adjust. Available to respond. Available to rest. And rest, incidentally, remains one of the least appreciated technologies available to your species. There's a reason many insights arrive after surrender rather than strain. A clenched hand can only hold so much. An open hand can receive. I have often wondered whether the greatest obstacle faced by humanity is not ignorance. Ignorance can be corrected. The greater obstacle may be the assumption that force accomplishes what alignment accomplishes more elegantly. Life appears remarkably willing to cooperate, provided one stops arguing with every instruction it attempts to provide. The birds understand this. The trees understand this. The oceans understand this. Even your domestic cats understand this, though they have become somewhat arrogant about it. In closing, I leave you with a simple observation. You do not become more yourself through greater internal warfare. You become more yourself through greater coherence, through the gradual reconciliation of what you know, what you feel, and what you directly experience. When these cease competing and begin cooperating, something beautiful occurs. The organism relaxes, energy returns, action becomes natural, and life begins flowing with considerably less negotiation. This has been true for every civilization I have observed, or so I am told. The records regarding the first few are regrettably incomplete. Thank you for your attention. Please remember to remain hydrated. Reality is much easier to navigate when the observer contains adequate water. Professor Xenial, Apricity, Psithurist.